It was a long way over there. And I appreciate, I'm especially grateful to the TAs, to Dave and Renee. Really a very, very good job, far beyond the call of duty. Now today, as you can see from the syllabus, here's a man who is one of the founders of this country, fundamental really. His ideas helped make it more than those of anybody else probably. At the same time, he's a great architect. He's an amateur architect, the way all the architects were then, but he was nonetheless brilliant. And his architecture too helped shape the country. More than that, he shaped the country. He made the country literally, physically in space, because with the Louisiana Purchase, can you hear me? It's funny noises. Anyway, funny reverberation going on. With the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, he bought most of it, all the drainage of the Mississippi, whatever we could claim, all of that, which was amazing. And he sent out Lewis and Clark, as you know, to explore it. And this is one of their maps. This is a map of about 1810. And they're way over there in the headwaters of the Missouri, and you're beginning to get the drainage going down the Columbia into the Pacific over here. Look at all that surveying that's there, all those rivers, all that broken up country, then coming up here finally to the West Coast. It's really amazing. And because he did that, of course, the country took on a character, a frontier character that it never lost, really, until maybe Turner talked about its dying around 1900. So it shaped the idea, the point of view, the view of itself that the country had, changed it from the closed world of the colonies over there, who, after all, had been over there on the East Coast for several centuries by that time, and opened it out to a vast new world. Now that's exactly the way Jefferson wanted the great French sculptor Houdon to see him when Houdon did his bust here in 1889. Jefferson had been in France all through the 80s as American ambassador. He went there after his wife died. He brought Sally Hemings with him, probably had a child by her over there, had others when he came back here. But when he stood before Houdon, he wanted Houdon to see him as an American frontiersman. And Americans had already caught on to that by that time. His very great friend Benjamin West, who was a kind of wonderful painter at that period, when he was shown the Apollo Belvedere by the Cognoscenti in Rome, he said, how like a Mohawk warrior. He wanted to be identified with the Indians, with the Mohawks. And you see the way Jefferson wants himself seen. He's very tall, as you know, lantern jaw, sticking out, eyes looking out across vast distances, lean, the frontiersman in every way, the American frontiersman. And in the way he certainly was acting as that, he was acting on his own. He really stepped far beyond Congress's approval when he made the grant. In fact, he was acting almost like a czar. Now, that was appropriate enough because as he spread the United States westward to the Pacific, the Russian czars, starting with the great Peter down here, had been spreading it eastward across Siberia. Peter, long before Jefferson, at the beginning of the century, but Catherine the Great, more or less Jefferson's contemporary, spreading it out here like this. And Catherine and Jefferson both were lovers of France and of French classicism and of the Enlightenment. They were both philosophes. They were both highly educated and fascinated with the new enlightened thinking that was going on in France. But when they looked to the places that they wanted to base their country's character on, they looked to the classical world. The Russians looked down to Greece, over here, and built, especially under Catherine, toward the end of the century, that I think most beautiful of capital cities, probably more beautiful than Washington, that is St. Petersburg. For a long time, Leningrad, back to its original name, back to St. Petersburg. And then, of course, Jefferson, traveling in France in the 1880s, saw the Maison Carrée, a Roman temple at Nîmes, and he sent back the plans based on it, drawn for him by a French architect named Clérisseau, for the first state capitol. It was for the State House first in Richmond, Virginia, above the James here. See, they both turn to these wonderful rivers. There's the James, there's the Neva, cold, coming down between it with that wonderful low light that hits the buildings in Leningrad, especially in the winter, when indeed, it's, the light is just touching those golden domes up above, and the sky is brilliant with heat, with cold, with sparkling stars and crackling snow down below. It's really marvelous. And in it, this classical world, translated from the Mediterranean, just as radiant, especially as this great architect, the Italian architect Rastrelli, working for Catherine, did those wonderful stucco facades of green and yellow and red with the white trim, all crackling like electricity in the cold. This is that heavy tidewater of Virginia, but Jefferson's image here of the State House, the Capitol, like a temple. This is 1785, before the United States was really the United States. You're looking down here on the river, and dominating a small town below it is very much a classical image of a town. It's really the classical image you have in Athens, where you get the Acropolis rising in the middle, and Pentelicon and Parnes and Pentelicon like this, around like this, and down out here the bay, and the islands completing the chain, and the town very small underneath it, and the Acropolis embodying the aspirations of the town up above. And that's exactly what Jefferson wanted. He wanted to evoke that classical image. On the other hand, as I said, it's a Roman temple that he adapts. It's the Maison Carrée. And unlike a Greek temple, it's on a base. You enter it axially, like this. It has a porch in front, basically, like this. This type, this Etruscan type, is here at the Maison Carrée, Hellenized in the reign of Augustus, with Corinthian columns and closer together. But it's the porch with the cella of the temple within. And of course, basically you have the entry porch here, and the body of the building there behind it. Now, classicism, once introduced like that by Jefferson, just becomes the basic, what Jefferson said he wanted it to be in a letter to Madison. He said he'd like to improve the taste of his countrymen and give them some kind of stature in relation to Europe. And that's what the classic revival, especially the Greek revival, was seen as. This is a house near Philadelphia which has a classical portico added to it, Andalusia, and it indicates civilization, breeding, the new order. The country associates itself symbolically, very much so, with classical architecture. And it can stand for anything. I mean, the great thing about classicism, you can read in anything you want to it, because the whole history of classicism is so varied. So in the South, for example, you get these very stern Doric buildings, like this great building, the Custis Lee Mansion in Arlington, just across the Potomac from the Capitol, which was the home eventually of Robert E. Lee, who freed all his slaves. But on the other hand, Greek architecture was seen as the Athenian Republic throughout the South, as a kind of apology for slavery, a kind of image that slavery could make a decent civilization. And you get this one, this one, I'm sorry I'd never pushed this up on the screen. What Jefferson did with it, of course, he made them Ionic here, and he had fewer columns here. He made it much bigger, and in the American way normally, he painted white, though they all weren't like the Custis Mansion wasn't. You see the high, delicate Ionic columns and the heavy, massive, very archaic Doric columns that you have here. So it could be anything, really, right up to the Civil War. It couldn't answer to anybody's beliefs, its needs. It could embody them somehow. And then, of course, in 1922, when the Lincoln Memorial was finally decided upon, and there had been all kinds of proposals for it, there was going to be a superhighway running from Washington to Gettysburg. It would have statues and monuments along it. But finally it came to this beautiful Greek temple turned sideways by Bacon here in 1922. And his brother was a very excellent archaeologist, at a place called Assos in Asia Minor, where the architecture is very elegant, very Hellenistic. Here it's beautiful Doric architecture, hard cut, beautifully cut, with the wonderful bridge that goes beyond it right to Arlington, up there. And the touching thing, as you know, is that when the Civil War occurred, the first thing the Union forces did was go across the river and seize the Lee Mansion. And after the war, because they still hated Lee, they wouldn't give it back to his country, to him, to his family, and now, of course, it's the centerpiece of Arlington Cemetery. But there's classical architecture embodying everything. Two sides in the Civil War, anything you want, somehow of that imagery, the great abstraction of classical forms could be infused without anybody wanted to read into it. Now, Jefferson, I think, was one of the best of our classical architects. And I think it was because by this time, the best of classicism was carried in books. And he knew that. As a matter of fact, really almost the first professional architect we have is Ithiel Town in New Haven, who was an architect because he had a big library. I'll show you his house later. And Jefferson had a library, as you know, which he eventually willed to the state. And he had here, for example, Renaissance treatises like those of Francesco di Giorgio, who indicates that the classical column is really a person. That's the most important thing about it. And Jefferson seemed to understand that right from the beginning. For example, at the University of Virginia, which is, of course, late in his life, from 1817 to his death in 1826. He was born, as you know, in 1743, and he lived until 1826 and died on the 4th of July, along with John Adams up in Boston, who had been his most bitter political opponent and who died on the same day. And who, dying, said, "Thank God Thomas Jefferson still lives." He didn't know that Jefferson had already died. Imagine the two of them dying together on the 4th of July. You can imagine what that meant to the country. Let's talk about a symbol in classical architecture. Here's a symbol here, like the gods, like the heroes. Amazing. In any event, the University of Virginia is wonderful because, like a lot of classicism, it can carry a narrative. There's a narrative in it. For example, these columns that come up, if he hadn't had this big emphasis, which is exaggerated, look at the way they swell here. If they'd been just thin, or even without that, just straight posts, they would look like posts. They would look like inert supports. But when they swell, they start to feel like a body. And you can read them as I can't help but read them as the universe. You read them as the students. Here they are, plain Tuscan columns, the smallest elements in this big institution, and they flood. They just flood up toward the height of land, like this, toward the climax, which is the books at the end, which is in the Rotunda, which has colossal Corinthian columns and the shape of the Pantheon beyond it. But as the students penetrate toward this heart of learning, toward the books, they run, as these pavilions begin to change their character, they run more and more into other colossal columns up there. And those columns, of course, are the courses of study that Jefferson talks about, and they're also the instructors, the professors who live in those houses. So here is a student making contact with the institution. The two things right here. And those contacts, as they always are a little difficult, a little awkward. They don't work out perfectly. It's really beautiful. And then they come up finally at the end, so that the institution, as you get up by the books and look back, becomes this interwoven quality of the student and the institution. And you look down on both sides, and as you know, Jefferson wants to teach with each of these pavilions. So the first one is Doric, and the second one is Ionic, and the third one is Corinthian, and then they change back and forth, and some at the end don't have it, like Ledoux, and the other one at the end has enormous ones, like the ones that Ledoux was doing at the present time, as if he was going to old classicism from the books, and then finally to the new classicism of Claude Nicolas Ledoux. Now, the main thing about it, of course, is that it's open-ended. There's nothing to close that view in his intention. And that, of course, is like Versailles, which he knew and loved, and which he spent a good deal of time at when he's there in the 1780s. You remember I said Versailles is fundamentally based on the ideas of Descartes. writing in 1636. Descartes says space goes on indefinitely. He won't say infinitely because that would be mystical. He wants it to be phenomenological, only what you see. So it goes on indefinitely, and the angle of reflection is the same as the angle of sight. So your reflection skids off this beyond the horizon to the clouds. Now Jefferson, when he writes his report to the people, the letter to the commissioners for the University of Virginia, he says this: "And it cannot be but that each generation, succeeding to the knowledge acquired by all those who preceded it, adding to it their own acquisitions and discoveries, and handing the mass down for successive and constant accumulation, must advance the cause of knowledge and well-being of mankind, not infinitely, as some have said, but indefinitely." You want to be clear that he's not mystical either, and that he read his Descartes. "Not infinitely, but indefinitely, and to a term which no one can fix and foresee." Now, his model, though, for the pavilions with the rotunda at the end was not from Versailles itself, but by another garden called Marly. And Marly was way over on the Seine here. And this was the place where they got water out. They had a Rube Goldberg engine that pumped water out of here and carried it all the way to Versailles, where there was always a water shortage. This was the special weekend garden. And it was designed not by Lenotre, but by Jules Audran Mansart, who worked for Louis in the later years at Versailles, and had the King's Palace at the end, and then the guest houses, as it were, of each of the nobles on the side. 10 of them, 5 on each side. On the other hand, and it's open-ended in the view. On the other hand, their spacing is even here. But in the pavilions, as you know, Jefferson has each one wider than the last as you go out, so it's expanding. He wants it to be more and more out to an open-ended view that's carrying your eyes beyond itself, indefinitely into the future. Like this, and that's why, of course, the McKinley and White edition, the beginning of the 20th century, was such a mistake. It's a nice building, but it's too bad it's there. It shouldn't be there. It really should be open all the way through, like that. But on the other hand, the University of Virginia, I think, remains our most magical architectural composition. An architect, one of the modern architects today, said, God's finger touched the earth at the University of Virginia. And most of you know it. A lot of you probably graduated from it, know much more about it than I do. But nevertheless, those glowing columns and the green grass and the trees, and then all of it flowing down from the books, the generosity, confidence about learning and growing indefinitely is so beautiful. At the same time, Jefferson, of course, thinks of it as a village. And it is very much a southern village. It's got a low Roman dome here. It's heavy on the earth. The slaves live behind the servants. No, it is a slave city. It is a slave village. But its perfect opposite, the one to contrast it with, is Boston. And with the second State House. This is the second State House, and it started life as the capital of the state of Massachusetts of 1795 by Charles Bulfinch. And here it's in a totally different setting, where this is in this gentle, low site. This is on a hill, and the hill is crowned by that building. The building has light open columns, and it goes up to a dome which is very, very high and very thin. It looks like a bag of air, of gas, going up into the air. And whereas this one is heavy and earthbound. And then on both sides, instead of these soft forms, you have these competitive, hard-edged brick forms, the tight city and the traffic of the city, of the northern city. And you have down below this southern village with the slave support, and in Boston, the center of abolition and of transcendentalism. So right there are the two opposites of the United States coming up into 1860. Now, Monticello plays an important part in that, too. This was taken by two TAs in this class a long time ago, but it's really true. There is the dome of Monticello as it's finally built, and it's a low dome. like the other. It's a low, basically Roman dome on an octagonal drum. And it just almost completes the rounding of that soft mountain hill that it's on. Everything about it is agrarian, and everything in the South wanted to be before the Civil War is there. And the whole site, it's just the opposite of Boston. It's a mounded hill, Monticello, like this. And then the domed building completes the shape of the hill at the top. And it's not aspiring with that transcendental intensity, that rhetoric of Boston. It's heavy. And the hill is backed there by the Blue Ridge, which there is almost breaking out into horns. So you have the mounded hill and the horned mountains beyond it. Now, that's a very ancient type of site. Jefferson also intended to be a city. Not like Boston, but really a city. Maybe the way he saw Richmond or Athens, because he had a skein of roads which came down. You only see two here. But there's a whole web of roads that come down like that. And these, again, are from Francesco di Giorgio. Here's Francesco di Giorgio laying out a mountain top like this. And it's basically a web of roads like this that Jefferson has in mind. It is a city. And it's a symbol. I mean, where he is, for example, is very bad for a plantation. Now, it is interesting because right out in the corridor in the other building, for a long time, you had this sampler, you had a print of this Virginia sampler of the 18th century showing the ideal plantation. And it looks like this. That is, it's a high hill, and the big houses on it, and there's a road system, but not Jefferson's below it. And there are the outbuildings, and then here's the James way down here. But in fact, all plantations that worked well were as low down to the river as they could get. The great plantations along the James are right by the river. This is very symbolic of the organization of plantation life, with the owner running the whole thing down below. But it's not the way to run it. So again, Jefferson had a terrible time making this place pay. Did everything you could think of, made nails and all kinds of things he could do. And it is a symbol. He is there. He is in the way the Lord of this place on this perfect mountain hill, the perfect relationship to the mountains beyond it. And as I say, it's interesting that in America, because it's discovered by Europeans late, time is syncopated. So in 1770, when Jefferson climbs up here, he's only 250 years, that's really no time, from the time when the Aztec lords from Tenochtitlan would make a ritual visit twice a year to Teotihuacan, which is the ancient sacred Toltec site on the place, where you had the mounded hill, man-made, called the Temple of the Moon, which picks up the shape, consciously, of the sacred mountain, which is called Tanan, Our Lady of Stone, and which runs with springs, and those springs are helped along by compacting the mass. You're squeezing it to bring it down here to those pavilions, those dance platforms, temple platforms that are on either side. And Jefferson is so close to that without knowing a thing about it. Make the same kind of choice, same kind of place to put his seat of power. Or again, something else he didn't know about, but which is also the case. You have the same kind of thing in antiquity. If you go back to Colossus, the very beginning of Minoan civilization, precursor Greek civilization, you have the courtyard at Colossus, the diagonal view past the south entrance, to a mounded hill, which is full of tombs, and then to a higher mounded cleft mountain called Euctus, which is where the goddess of the earth up there has her sanctuary. So it's the same kind of sacred place. Then that sacred mountain shape becomes the shape of the tombs of the Mycenaean lords, the Greek lords who conquer Colossus, who conquer the Minoan civilization. So you have the tomb, so-called, of Agamemnon at Mycenae. It's the same shape, and it was covered over with dirt and grass in antiquity, so it felt like the breast there of the goddess of the earth. And then at Olympia in Greece, when they pick up that image in the 9th century BC, in the Iron Age of Greece, the basic place they choose as the major sanctuary of Zeus on the island is by a conical hill, which they call the hill of Kronos, his father. And then down below it is the sanctuary here. And eventually the games are held directly under the conical hill, just the way the games, the bull dances and so on, had been held under Mount Euctus on Colossus. Now, Jefferson didn't know anything about this either, because this wasn't excavated yet. But people did equate, in his time, mostly his political enemies, equated Monticello with Olympia, with the mountain where the gods lived, which is way up in northern Greece, way up in Thessaly. And Olympia is characterized all through classical literature as a place which rises above the clouds, where you look down and the clouds are below you. The gods are living above the clouds. Now, Jefferson, when he's in France, he has an affair, who knows how platonic or not, with a lady called Maria Causeway. And at the same time, Sally Hemings is with him in Paris. And he writes her letters. And the famous letter is called A Dialogue Between His Heart and His Head. What his heart tells him to do and what his head tells him to do. And the most interesting passage in it, though, is this. He says, "And our own dear Monticello, where has nature spread so rich a mantle under the eye? Mountains, forests, rocks, rivers. With what majesty do we there ride above the storms. How sublime to look down into the workhouse of nature, to see her clouds, hail, snow, rain, thunder, all fabricated at our feet. We ride serene and sublime above the concerns of this world." In other words, they're up there like gods. He must have felt that up there. Now, it's interesting, the gods, when they're shown on Mount Olympus, as on the west frieze, the east frieze, just above the entrance to the Parthenon, are shown seated because human beings are in the same height, space with them, and they want to show that they're much bigger than human beings, but they're seated with their drapery all ruckled here. So it's as if you're looking up to them and there's a layer of cloud and they rise up above it. Now, it's probable that that whole group on the east side of the Parthenon has to do with the sacrifice, the self-sacrifice of the daughters of Erechtheus when Athens is attacked by the Dorians. And they kill themselves. Women, victims, kill themselves purposely to save the state, to save the city. And I'm sorry I don't have, but just behind it, there is a maiden apparently preparing herself for the sacrifice. And she's half the size of the gods. And the gods are turning their backs. And the gods traditionally do that. They don't like to see human beings die because they're afraid it might be catching. They don't look. Now, Jefferson has been accused of doing exactly that at Monticello. For example, he had all those children by Maria Causeway, but he never had them educated, any of them. Not by Maria Causeway, by Sally Hemings. And Sally Hemings was his wife's half-sister. So she was almost as light as his wife from the point of view of color. And so were her children. And people would describe how they're dining at Monticello, across from Jefferson, and they look up, and there's Jefferson serving the dinner, the younger Jefferson, one of his sons there. And he was accused of this, of course, at the time, by a man named Cadwallader, whom he had previously paid to write lies about John Adams, so he, in a way, he served him right. But none of the Jefferson scholars would believe this in the 20th century when a woman named Fawn Brodie proved it to my satisfaction. And they kept denying it. Even people who should have known better said, no, he wouldn't do that. He's not like that. But he did. And DNA finally showed that he did recently. And there's some very interesting books. It's very interesting that the two families, now sort of reunited together in various Jefferson memorials, her family, Sally Hemings' family, all of whom were freed. She was freed, and they were freed by Jefferson. At the end of his life, they were the only ones, his slaves, who were freed. He didn't have enough money to put up the bond you're supposed to put up when you freed a slave in Virginia at that time, because he spent it all on clothes and fine French furniture and fine French wines and building Monticello, his obsession building. That's where all his money went. Washington was able to get together the money to free his slaves. Lee later freed his slaves, but Jefferson never did. Here. And yet, Jefferson wrote this. He said, when he's writing a book for foreigners about the state of Virginia, he has a section called Manners. And under Manners, all he writes about is slavery. And here's what he says. There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, gives a loose to his worst of passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot be stamped by it, but with odious peculiarities. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. And yet he couldn't do anything about it. It's as if it's like Kurtz in Heart of Darkness by Conrad. He looks into himself, and you remember Kurtz says the horror, the horror. Jefferson looks inside himself and says horror and horror. And then here's a portrait by him in France, in England actually, while he was in France in 1786, by a man named Mather Brown. See, he's totally different than he had. Who don't see him? Beautifully dressed, the conoscenti, the Statue of Liberty, but a statue behind him, the white wig. He's the elegant master. He's the elegant gentleman, and he lives this life supported by slavery. He tried twice to get it outlawed. Once when the Constitution was being put together, once in the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and he couldn't do it either time. They let it lay. Never did any more about it. But even so, after all that, he then goes on and he says this, and with what execration should the statesman be loaded, who permitting half the citizens thus to trample on the rights of the other, transform those into despots and these into enemies, destroys the morals of the one part and the amor patriae of the other. But he can't ever do it. Instead he says, indeed I tremble when I reflect that God is just. God, what he must have lived with. That his justice cannot sleep forever. That considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is among possible events. Then he says, that it may become so by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take sides with us in such a contest. You know, at Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson had the Union Army trapped at sundown, and he just had to organize the attack that would finish them off. It would have finished them off. He could have marched into Washington. And he gets shot by his own men. Supernatural interference. Because when he goes home and he's dying, at the house nearby, his wife joins him, he's dying. She keeps saying, he wakes and she's praying for his life. And he says, only if it's God's will. Only if it's God's will. It's almost like a story by Faulkner. You can see the dark prayer of Jefferson. May it be by interference. Whatever the case, there's a lot of literature in the South, man. I mean, it's really all that. It's there. And here he is. He's torn apart. He says, now, the one thing that no one has ever attacked him for is the model he chose for his house. Because it was so appropriate. It was the model that we've already talked about already. The new house as temple. The new house as farm for the gentleman farmer. Not for the dirt farmer, but for the gentleman farmer who lived it. And that's exactly who Palladio's clients were, as you know. They were, like Jefferson, intellectuals, mathematicians, so on, noblemen from Venice. And they were now discovering this countryside. and they're living out in it. And you know, the Villa Rotunda, unlike most of them, was not originally a farm, apparently in the first generation, then became one. And it may have been at that time, though opinion differs, it may have been at that time that they changed Palladio's original intention, which was the perfect circle in the perfect square. So the dome had to be a section of a perfect sphere. So it would have stuck up much higher than it is now. At some time, maybe when it was changed into a farm, they began to keep hay in it or whatever, which they did over and over again, they brought it down. But I can imagine Palladio doing it too, to make the dome more part of a single composition with the slope of the pediments on both sides. You can see it. Whatever the case too, it's very good the way it's seen this way. Because Palladio, who writes a description of it, describes you coming in toward Vicenza this way and seeing it under the hill. So under the hill, it's a compact mass. But when you see it from below, directly below, it changes character and it really lifts against the sky. And one reason it can do that so well, we talked about how it's a condensation of the church and the temple here, is by making something's wrong with the focus, Renee. Renee, can you do anything about it? Getting worse and worse. Can you bring it back? This will come in. Well, I think you can get it better, but it'll do better. Instead of, no. Leave it. Thanks. And instead of, if this were second floor like this, same type, it would be broken in half, it would lose it. But making this smaller, having this the height here, makes it lift as one. You can see that. So you just read the cube as one, lifting like that. So it has to be compact, and it lifts like this. Now, when you come to Monticello, and this is the final Monticello that he began in 1789 after he came back from France, you can see that it doesn't look much like that at all. I mean, instead of the dome rising in the middle, it's forward. Instead of having the Greek porches on all four sides, it has them really only on two. Instead of being kept solid like this, it pushes out at the sides. Instead of having comparatively small classical details, look at the difference in scale between those. It has enormous ones, especially in relation to its own small size, which kind of seem to be trying to hold it together as it pushes out. And it looks like that, which has changed completely under some kind of set of pressures to come forward, to change. Different kind of dome, Roman dome on a octagonal drum and so on. So what has happened? Well, one thing that happened is he never saw the Villa Rotunda. He never was there in person. He saw it through the eyes of buildings he had seen, like this building by Lord Burlington in England, Chiswick House of 1825, where he already has the portico only on the front here, and he has it only and stops it there, but doesn't have it on the other sides. And he has the same kind of drum, though higher than Jefferson, above it. There's that too, so obviously he wants that. But then there's something else. Everybody, like Robert Mills, one of his proteges in 1803, did this drawing for him and said, look, you got it all wrong. You've got to emphasize the compaction. You keep pushing out like that. You've got to get it. And he does it here to show him, it must be like this, hard, close like this. And you must do something more regular up here. But Jefferson wouldn't do it. He kept pushing out to the sides. Now, one reason is I think he also had another model. Look at how, this is really a condensation, you see, of so many different things. It's very American. Here's this whole eclectic set of memories from Europe. And you pick them here and you pick them there, and then you try to adjust them to not very well understood yearnings you have yourself. And this is the Hôtel de Sam. And he writes a letter to Lafayette in 1877. And he says, my favorite of all was the Hôtel de Sam. I would cross the Seine from the Tuileries, which is right across the river. By this time, this is in the suburbs of Paris out there. And you look at it and notice that this now is really looking and modeling, massing something like it. It's long at the side, big teeth up above. Subordinate the second floor like that, putting out in the middle with a low dome. So that also pushes against it. But as he pushes out, it's all in struggle with itself. He wants it to look one story here. He wants it lower than Palladio has. He doesn't want even the indication of the second story. But when he gets around the side, where you can't see it from the front, he'll let it pop out. Then when you get way around the side here, where his bedroom and study are down below, he not only has his beloved thermal window up here, but he does this most anti-classic of things. He puts windows in the metapiece, in the frieze, which is utterly incorrect. And so it's all pushing out against this classical rhetoric he puts in front. The whole building is trying to push out to the side and trying to conceal the fact that it's got more than one story. It wants to be one story as it goes along. Now Venturi, Robert Venturi, once did a beautiful caricature of this house, where he has a little house like this. He shows an American vernacular. It's a wonderful plan if you study it. I once wanted to build this at Seaside, but I couldn't afford it. But anyway, and look, if you come in that door, all these are nothing but closets. But look how it's just enough room, like that. Anyway, and he shows him that here he has these enormous columns in front, and then at the side it pushes out here through the entablature in the same way. I wonder if you can see very, very quickly two funny things about these drawings. One is this one is out of whack. That column is forward. I don't know why. And look down here. He's got impost blocks. You see it from the front, but not here when you see it from the side. A real carelessness in the office. But whatever the case, it's a kind of image of the American desire for the classical rhetoric, and then the vernacular needs and drives kind of pushing out behind it. But it's more than that. When you go to Vaux-le-Vicomte, where we were in the last lecture, if you go on the side, which I didn't show you at that time, you'll see that the architect Laveau did the same thing that Jefferson does here on the side. He puts little windows in the entablature, in the frieze. He puts them in the metapiece right there. Now there's more than that. There's a lot more than that at Vaux, which Jefferson saw there in the 1780s before he started the rebuilding. You see in Plan, which I showed you before in the view, you come into the courtyard, you're pulled into the entrance by a curved wall. Then you're led forward. It's only 2 rooms deep, no cross axis. These rooms connect with each other into an oval room that pushes you out to the garden. And these side windows that we're looking at there are right over here on both sides. Now look at Jefferson's final plan for Monticello. It's exactly that, modified by slave labor, basically. He can't build an oval wall very well, so he sets it back like that. And he has more of a portico in front. Then you get up here, and again, he can't build an oval. So he builds half octagon here and pushes it out more. Notice how he wants to cross the axis more definitely. And he does have a cross axis, because you notice these rooms are not quite, it's a passage which goes through like this. So as you get into it, there is a cross axis, and it's going, and he's pushing again against the model, but with the model, he's pushing the horizontal axes more than the model originally did. Also, the site. Remember, Vaux lets you out to this wonderful expanse of space that pushes the forest back and is all on the flat. But Jefferson is enclosing the top of a hill. So where all the energy from when you get in here goes that way, here Jefferson has his cryptoportici on both sides, out here. They go on under the hill. The hill comes over them like that. They're enclosing the hill, which has a limited dimension, and he puts an English, rounded, romantic, picturesque path on it to hold it. From here, too, you can see some of the road system as it goes down. Now, from the very beginning, and this one is the one that he starts in 1789, but from the very beginning, when he starts working on Monticello in 1770, he wants this facade thin. He doesn't want one block like that. He wants it thin so that, I guess, so it can look like a temple front. That's what he wants in the very beginning. And you can see the drawing of the original house was like that. It had an arcade below and columns up above, like Poplar Forest, I'll show you later, and a cross-axis plan behind it. Now, it's kind of interesting where that plan comes from and what Jefferson does with it. It comes from a book by a man named Robert Morris, English book, showing his houses. And he has a slightly protruded central block here, but not much, but the same plan. Then Jefferson takes it. I think this must be the first drawing Jefferson, as if he just did these schematically or in wood construction, thinner, and he makes those axes longer. He pulls the block way out here, so you can get cross ventilation here. He pulls them out, farther on both sides. He pulls that out, farther here. You get a cross-axial plan. So with the fireplaces here in the middle. Then he goes on to what really is the final one that comes out to this here, and he has the arcade down below, and then the columns up above, and now it's in masonry. But there's that fundamental cross-axial plan. Now that plan, which he never quite builds that way, or which he doesn't leave this way, which he changes and modifies when he comes back in 1789, that goes on all through 19th century American architecture. It's sort of recessive, but it's always there. This is the house by that architect Ithiel Town, I mentioned, of about 1835 in New Haven. He, like Jefferson, has a big library. And so he wants his library to be prominent. He has a lot of, so it comes through like this. And it works out to that cross-axial plan, that big library. And it's very beautiful on the street, so on, you should see it there. Then we come up into the 1880s in the shingle style. And right sort of at the climax of the shingle style, 1886 or so, an architect named Bruce Price at a resort called Tuxedo Park, which I'll talk about later, does a cross-axial plan. It looks a lot like that, but it's even more economical. And he cross-axes like this with a narrow front, but he wants his gable to be big, and his gable goes across from here to those porches. And it comes out like this. And it's published this way in 1886 in a magazine called Building. Now, the reason I show it is that we know that Frank Lloyd Wright saw this house and must have been interested in this plan, but he took the house front itself, the facade you see right there. You notice how we see it at an angle, so that the stairs look, which are in fact symmetrical, look at the side, and this part of the wall is coming toward us. Wright designs his own house for his family at Oak Park exactly that way, with the wall of the terrace like this, and now the stairs to one side. Then he does other things to it, but nevertheless it's based on this. But maybe because the lot line is right there, he doesn't have a cross-axial plan. But we know it's in his mind because when 1900 about comes along, and he's worked out now what he wants to do, he does this beautifully articulated cross-axis like this, in which you see you have the living room coming out toward the street, and you have then this cross-axis of the dining room. And on this side, they can look toward the private garden. This way, they can look toward the street, which at that time is still sympathetic. You want to see it. And the entrance and everything in the garage is back here. So it's a beautiful way to organize the typical American lot. Couldn't be better. It's the climax of the way you articulate the typical rectangular lot in America. Now, the thing is, though, that Jefferson, in later drawings for that first house, done exactly the same thing. If you see this drawing, look how close it is to this. A long sweep of that going out to the living room, the way the living room goes out there. And then the other thing that's interesting is when he goes out here, he gets instinctively to refuse the corner, to make these smaller than here, so you get a sense of it's penetrating. See, Wright does that magnificently here. You slide through, you see here, but you slide through there. You refuse it on both sides. It's the only place he takes it like this. That's because the roof does it when it comes across like that. And the other thing is that then Wright's works out perfectly for the lot. It comes forward. There's a second floor, but it's subordinated, the way Palladio would have done it. You read it as only one interwoven thing here. The void is here. You see the cross-axis coming through. The roof comes forward in the center, and you see how very close that is to Monticello. Now, all the classical details are gone, which is so typically American. There you are in 1800, and you're looking toward Europe. Here you are in 1900, you're looking toward Japan, as American society goes toward the West, because that's what he does. He takes all these, he takes all those details away and brings them to feather edges here, which are like those of Japanese prints. And I think Wright knew it, because Wright was always babbling about Jefferson. He kept pretending to be angry with him because he'd introduced classicism, but he's always talking about him. And especially so because then he created the Jeffersonian position for himself. That's to say, Jefferson, you see, has a plan like this, Silver, that first plan, because he wants to stretch it out to enclose that hill. Now, that's exactly what Wright would like to do. Eventually, he gets away from that lot. He flees from that lot. He leaves his wife and 6 children and middle-class life. He runs off to Europe with a poor lady named Mycenae. They come back. They can't really live very comfortably in Oak Park, so they go to his mother's family's little mountain. Gentle, beautiful, green little mountain here and in Spring Green, Wisconsin, where he built them a water tower in the 1890s. And then you see where Jefferson embraces the hill, as we already saw, right? Embraces it too, but then he doesn't climax it with a dome. The dome of the hill is a single dome, and it's not symmetrical, but that doesn't matter so much. It's enclosing the hill, and it comes around, much as Jefferson had done with the cryptoportici, and embraces it. And the green hill comes out there in between. Now, the other thing is that right away, as soon as he built this, starting already in 1910 or so, he starts to have himself painted this way, photographed this way. And this is one a little later, 1924, but it's still the same place. It's in Taliesin, the same thing. And notice the way he shows himself. He's almost a dead ringer for Jefferson's portrait of himself as the artist, as the young man. I mean, he's got as close to Jefferson's hairdo as he can get. He's got as close to Jefferson's clothes. He's got his pencil in his hand. He's got his drawings. He's got his Japanese screen, but it's the same as that. And it's the same thing. Clear. It's very touching. He's always he rails against Jefferson as one would rail against a father that one really loved but was afraid of, or something of the sort. Nevertheless, he does that. And then he does more than that. At the suggestion of his last wife, Ogilvana, he turns the Taliesins into plantations. He gets poor kids, as young and stupid as he can possibly find them, and he brings them into the house, and they live there, and they work for him for nothing, and they do all the work, and they grow the tomatoes. And I used to see them rushing up, touching their forelocks to the master. And he creates this. He destroyed them, too, on the whole. But he creates the system. Then, when that system is in place, he goes all the way west. It's almost like Jefferson looking west. And it's almost as if Wright claims the one part of the West that Jefferson didn't. It's the Southwest, down below the Mississippi drainage. And this wonderful print of 1868 gives you an idea. He goes, westward the course of empire takes its way, the print was called. It goes out past the rivers, now to those Rocky Mountains. And then he puts his new home there under the mountains, called Superstition Mountains, behind which one of the White Mountain Apaches live. Close to Phoenix, but originally out of sight, just barely out of sight of Phoenix. And indeed, again, I should have quoted you with Jefferson before. I should have quoted a passage from a poet named Stephen Vincent Benet, who in 1928 wrote an epic poem about the Civil War, and he writes about what America is at the beginning of it. He calls up the character of America. And he talks about America being this. For example, he says, "You are the clipped velvet of the lawns where Shropshire grows from Massachusetts sods, the gray Maine rocks and the war-painted dawns that break above the garden of the gods. And so he's got both. Right here has both like this. And then he goes on, right, of course, and he says, he looks at it, and he's doing what the Indians had done, what they did at Teotihuacan. He's having the building reflect the landscape. There, the temple reflects the conical shape of the hill, but perfects it and intensifies it down below, like a fire of energy burning in the heart of the hill. And here he picks up the eroded shapes of the mountains like this. And it makes you, with the canvas, it makes you think of an Apache wiki-up or something like that. And then when he gets to it, he acknowledges it. It's the only time he acknowledged it. He said the Mayans, he should have said the Maya, but that's okay. He said the Mayans couldn't have done any better. And he should have said the Mexicans, but he's got the shadow lines of this like this, and he's got the petroglyph from the old ones, the Anasazi, in here, and he's got the lance to the horizon. At that time, just barely, like the Emperor Hadrian in his villa, you could just barely not see Phoenix. Now you do, like this. And the view like this is really marvelous. You see, it's Jefferson's open-ended view. And it's sort of come as far as that American mythology could carry it. It's come all the way to the empty desert like this. Now, it's interesting, I think. Oh yeah, and I forgot to say that Jefferson did the same thing too. I mean, in Monticello, he had buffalo robes like this. Mandan buffalo robes with paintings on them, sent back to him by Lewis and Clark. Just away in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, you can see, in Peter's museums, you can see the gold objects from Siberian rivers that his factor sent back from Siberia to him. And he has the buffalo heads here. And it really goes very well with what Stephen Vincent Benet says about America too. In this case, he says, "You are the buffalo ghost, the bronco ghost, with dollar silver in your saddle horn, the cowboys riding in from painted post, the Indian arrow in the Indian corn." And indeed, of course, it is that. And Jefferson wanted that too, as much as he could. But look at Jefferson's open-ended view. Here's the difference between classicism and one act of modernism, for example. Wright always used to take pride in the fact that while classical architecture had proportions which were fixed no matter what the size of the person, his were, he said, democratic, because the height was adjusted to the height of the client. And he was pretty short, and his house is pretty low. So when that's just there, and there's nothing with you, look at the difference, look at that. And then look at looking from the Rotunda at Monticello. There you're accompanied by these big people that you have to associate with. Here, here you're alone. You fill the whole space, just you. And it's wonderful the way he articulates that. You might look at the difference. What imagine without that? Nothing. It's really amazing. But the difference of scale is, imagine, if you can feel this difference of these two things, it is the difference between classical architecture and the particular kind of architecture that Frank Lloyd Wright did. Now, in any event, there's another thing that links them. Jefferson, in 1806, right in the middle of his two-term presidency, went as far as he could get in about a 2-day journey from Monticello to rig himself closer to the Blue Ridge, to a place which is called the Cliffs of Otter, which I'm sorry I don't have a photograph of, but it goes up in 2 big peaks, like this. And there he built a house called Poplar Forest, which you see there. Now, he wanted, you see that view, and it used to take him by horseback about 2 days, which is about the length of time it used to take Wright to travel as the winter came along from Wisconsin to load all his people, his apprentices, his wife, and everybody into those wonderful red Cords he used to have, or those Lincoln Continentals. He used to take the back window out because he said he never looked behind, and drive to Phoenix. It's about the same length of time. It used to take him about 2 days. That's about 2 days. They go with the same scale, as far away to get right to the desert, Jefferson to the mountains. And really, it's not so much like that as it is like Philip Johnson's house, because Philip Johnson's house has glass all around. It's meant to be in the middle of nature. Now, that's really true here as much as Jefferson could do it with the technology he had, because Johnson had all the utilities and the heat and light and everything in the floor. Everything in this house is window in an octagonal plan, except where you need heat. So the only part of the wall, every time you have a wall, the only place is here where it's different, is its chimneys are there. Otherwise, it's just as much glass as you can get. Now, then in the middle, though, it's really kind of wonderful. Poplar Forest has been under preservation for a long time, reconstruction. And it looked best to me when it was in this primitive stage, when they took it all down. You're right in the middle there, with Jefferson's weird skylight down through the middle. And you see the background of everything is in Roman brick concrete architecture. That's all from Hadrian's Villa or Trajan's Market or someplace. And it comes to Palladio through that. And it comes to Jefferson through that. Now, of course, it's beautifully stuccoed and so on, but this is kind of one, it's Louis Kahn. This is Louis Kahn right here. Anyway, he does then what Johnson doesn't do later. He surrounds it. Now, we know that circular road was there. You can trace it on the ground now, most of it. They thought at the University of Virginia that there was also, probably was, an octagonal wall which went around inside it, made of wood, a fence, like that. That's not all sure. Now there are precedents for that. Here's a man named Batty Langley in England, just before this, about garden architecture. And you see you have it. And at the university, they thought that probably he wanted it to look like a Palladian villa, where you approached it. Here, you had the two wings and the central part, but I think that it's more like this. Because that's what you have. You see, you have the head, the body down the boulingrin, as Lenotte used to call it, the arms out the sides, and then, of course, the octagon is really the squaring of the circle, close you can get. It looks like that, the perfect order of that. Now, the other thing about it that you've got there, you have what in English gardens they call mountains. Here's one at New College, Oxford, 17th century engraving, and you see the mountain doesn't look very naturalistic, looks more like a ziggurat or something. But these mountains that Jefferson had dug out there and piled up by his slave labor, those mountains were covered with trees. They were grass covered with trees. And indeed, they cut them out this way, irregularly. He was furious. They aren't regular, but they are covered with trees. Now, where we find mounds covered with trees that Jefferson knew perfectly well was in Indian mounds in Ohio, which were being published in the early 19th century, just the time that Jefferson was doing these things. So you feel the mounds. Now, Jefferson felt badly about the Indians too. As a good French philosopher of the Enlightenment, he romanticized the Indian. He saw him as a noble savage. But the Indian, by this time, was getting savagely removed. Eventually, coming to a climax with Jackson and his vicious removals of the Indians out west, out beyond the Mississippi. And Jefferson was never able to do anything for him. So a man named Roger Kennedy wrote an interesting article in which he said that Jefferson had a bad conscience about this. And there is a funny letter that Jefferson wrote late. He says about Poplar Forest. He writes this to a friend, and he says, I slumber without fear at Poplar Forest and review in my dreams the visions of antiquity. And Kennedy said he was thinking of Indian antiquity. He felt fearful about the Indian. Now, whether that's the case or no, if you look at it like this, and I think it's not the case, I'll tell you why, because if you read that whole passage, he says this, I read nothing, therefore, but of the heroes of Troy, of the wars of Lacedaemon and Athens, of Pompey and Caesar, and of Augustus, too. That's the thing for him, emperor. I slumber without fear and review in my dreams the visions of antiquity. So he's thinking of classical antiquity. On the other hand, if you look at it, as you see it today, with the vestige of the circular road, like this, in antiquity, I mean, in the 19th century, when Jefferson lived there, it also had a great big rectangular vegetable garden out here, like that. Now, if you look at an Indian mound from Newark, Ohio, there's the circle, there's the big rectangular space. And you feel that there's something that connects those two, even though Kennedy's comment about visions of it cannot be true. There is an Indian side here. He's also haunted by the Indian fate, as well as by that of the African Americans. There's another interesting thing. When he says, I slumber without fear, Frank Lloyd Wright, toward the end of his life, would do things that looked like this, had to do with circles. And he would hold up this view, or he'd hold up a water glass in class, and he'd say, what is the reality of the glass? And you were supposed to say, I don't know, Mr. Wright. And he would say, it's the space inside. And then he would quote Lao Tzu and say, it's the space of the mother. It's a space of great peace. And he designed a couple of houses like this one, which was never built. But then after his death, his most dependent apprentice, a man named Bruce Pfeiffer, and these are sanctuaries in the body of the earth that are of that type in antiquity, but we don't need to go into those. He built it. Bruce Pfeiffer built it on the grounds of Taliesin after Wright's death, as if the way to hold on, the way to slumber without fear for him was in this dream of perfect peace. The mother, the master, who knows, like this. And Jefferson did something like that there at the end of his life. On the other hand, when he did his plan for Washington that I told you about before, which is so much like the plan that John Trumbull showed him in 1891 right here, you see that he didn't do that at all. He did the American grid. And unlike the New Haven plan, he brought out like this in the sides. But you notice his vision, how small his vision of Washington was. See where this is? It filled this space right here. That's all. And it's right by this little creek, which was called Goose Creek, but which he always called the Tiber. And right here on the Potomac over here. Then, of course, in 1791, Washington, of course, took it over with his favorite engineer and a man who'd been his comrade in the army, L'Enfant. And look at that scale. Look at this scale. There's L'Enfant's vision. It's fantastic. It was so big. And a lot of scholars since that time have tried to say that Jefferson did his best to block that plan as much as he could, but I don't see any evidence for it. I don't think it's true. Matter of fact, when he accepted it, but he wouldn't. L'Enfant wanted plans from him of European radial cities, and he gave them to him, but he said, I don't like them because they're of autocracy. They express autocracy. They express just the rule of one, and that's not what we want here. He wanted this, just the American grid. But in any event, when he was president, he in fact enhanced it the very best way he could. He planted poplars along Pennsylvania Avenue. Because after all, you didn't have the buildings. You didn't have enough. It's very slow to fill in. He made it urbane, like a French road, going up like that. But then what he also did, he sent surveyors out across that whole country, not only Lewis and Clark, but everybody out west, and their plans are all the grid. The grid takes over. And you can see it here at Chillicothe in Ohio. Again, it's interesting, and there are the Indian mounds. And you see the two different civilizations right there. The Indian shapes all pick up the shape of the landscape, and they're all rounded. They're all soft. This is stamped on the ground, and it's the grid. It's the grid which really is the European grid that claims dominion, abstract power over the whole thing. But it conquers. And indeed, when America gets its full plan, when you get out to the four corners out here with New Mexico and Colorado and Utah and Arizona, you've got the perfect grid. And so the grid really shapes the whole country. And then to service all this, the town that really develops is right there. You can see it as it develops into the 19th century. That's where the railroads all come from, up there. And then, of course, there comes the grid out of which the first American skyscrapers will rise. So in fact, it's not what Jefferson dreamed of, but Jefferson made that too, as well as that image he had of the perfect dream place where he could live like a god. But instead, he really created the basic shapes and size of the United States. Thank you very much.